The call came just after dawn. My mother was gone, sudden heart failure in Bloomington. One moment I was staring at the half-empty coffee mug on my counter. The next I was gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. 42 years old. And I still felt like a child who had just lost her anchor. I drove to the office in a daze. The gray buildings along Wacker Drive blurred past me, and by the time I swiped my badge through the turnstile, I already knew the conversation ahead would leave me bruised. Cheryl's door was ajar, her fingers hammering at the keyboard as if the keys owed her rent. "I need 3 days off," I said. Voice steady though my chest shook. "My mother passed this morning. The funeral's in Indiana. I'll need to drive out, stay with family." She didn't look up. 2 days. She answered flatly. I blinked. It's a 9-hour drive each way. 2 days won't. She finally met my eyes, irritation flickering. Then attend virtually. Everyone's expected here. Norland's migration can't afford delays. I stood there, numb, while grief turned sour in my throat. A shadow crossed the doorway. Dorian Pike from HR, his sharp suit pressed to perfection, his tone colder than the lake wind. "You'll have to choose," he said. "Work or family." My heart thudded. On the corner of Cheryl's desk, her planner lay open, pages neat and precise. A block of red ink caught my eye. Markson approved PTO, ski trip, 7 days. My stomach twisted. My mother's funeral was negotiable, but a ski trip wasn't. The words I wanted to shout burned behind my teeth, but I swallowed them. I forced myself to nod. The movement small, mechanical. My throat ached as I turned away, my heels clicking against the polished floor. Back at my desk, the cubicles stretched around me like a maze I had walked for over 1,000 days. My computer hummed, screens filled with lines of code and dashboards, all the invisible work I had carried on my shoulders. My hands trembled above the keyboard, not from grief alone, but from something sharper, hotter, waiting to break free. I walked back to my cubicle, every step heavy as if I were dragging chains behind me. The gray partitions rose around me like walls I had built myself, one overtime shift at a time. My chair squeaked as I sat down, and I stared at the dual monitors glowing with dashboards I had designed, patched, and rebuilt more times than I could count. The years unspooled in my mind, weekends bent over integration code while snow fell outside, nights when my phone jolted me awake at 2 a.m. because a client couldn't find their reports. I had missed birthdays, barbecues, and my mother's quiet Sunday dinners. She never complained, only looked at me with those patient eyes, the kind that asked without speaking. When will you live for yourself? Colleagues had leaned on me for everything. I was the one who wrote the troubleshooting sheets, the undocumented scripts, the fallback processes that saved their projects. They called me the glue. Glue was never glamorous. It held everything together while being invisible, unnoticed until it cracked. Once, years ago, my mother had said to me, "Never let them confuse silence with weakness." At the time, I nodded, promising myself I understood. But I hadn't. I had swallowed my pride again and again, letting managers call my sacrifices team spirit while they handed promotions to louder voices. I told myself it was safer that way, that loyalty would protect me. Now, with the weight of her absence pressing on me, I saw the truth. I had traded dignity for a paycheck, respect for a chair in a windowless row. My silence had bought me nothing but exhaustion. The peeling motivational posters on the wall mocked me. Teamwork makes the dream work. I almost laughed. Dreams had no place here. I stared down at my hands resting on the desk. They were trembling, not from grief, but from something sharper rising in me. For the first time in years, the silence inside me wasn't submission. It was a storm-gathering force, waiting for the right moment to break loose. The apartment felt cavernous that night, though it was barely 600 square feet. I moved through the rooms without turning on the lights, letting the glow from the street lamps outside paint long shadows across the floor. The air was thick with the stillness that follows bad news. A silence so sharp it made the hum of the refrigerator sound accusatory. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the clock on the stove. 11:47 p.m. The digits glared back at me, a reminder that tomorrow had already begun and I was still sitting in the ruins of today. My chest felt hollow, but inside that emptiness something was shifting, hot and steady. I opened my laptop, the same one I had dragged across countless late nights. My fingers hesitated above the keys, but only for a breath. I logged into the corporate system, my old reflexes carrying me through the tunnels of VPNs and secure portals. Not to troubleshoot, not to patch, but to reclaim what was mine. In the directories I knew too well, my private stash waited annotated API call structures, configuration backups, troubleshooting notes that no one else bothered to write. Line after line of undocumented fixes, a hidden scaffolding that kept the whole machine upright. I thought of the nights I spent here while others laughed in bars, of the times I missed my mother's calls because I was solving problems no one else could. I started compressing files, encrypting folders, watching progress bars crawl across the screen. Each click felt like pulling bricks out of a wall I had been forced to build. In my mind, I saw the message I would leave documentation removed by original author. No backup available. The idea didn't scare me, it steadied me. For once, I wasn't preserving their empire at the cost of my own life. By the time the clock struck 2, I knew I was past the point of no return. My laptop whirred quietly as the last folder sealed shut, and I closed the lid with hands that no longer trembled, already imagining what dawn would demand of me. By 2:30, the drives were scrubbed clean, every directory I had ever patched, every hidden corner where I'd stored fixes, every shortcut that saved their deadlines gone. I copied my work onto an encrypted partition, triple-locked with keys only I knew, then erased the rest. I left behind one single text file, stark and final, removed by original author. No backup available. The quiet in my apartment was almost deafening, broken only by the whir of the laptop's fan. My body ached, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. For once, I wasn't the invisible scaffolding propping up someone else's empire. At 5:45 a.m., I drafted my resignation. No long speech, no polite thanks. Just 2 lines effective immediately. Elena Marquez. I attached it to an email, hit send, and felt something unclench inside my chest. I showered, dressed, and stuffed a few clothes into my backpack. By the time the city was waking, I was already in a rideshare heading for O'Hare. The streets glistened under early light, and for once, I didn't feel chained to the skyline receding behind me. Inside the terminal, travelers shuffled in lines, half asleep with coffee cups in hand, murmuring about delays. I stood apart, ticket in my pocket, backpack heavy with the only things that mattered now. My phone vibrated endlessly in my jacket calls, texts, notifications piling on top of each other. Cheryl, Dorian, even Hal from operations. I didn't need to read them to know the panic. I slid the phone into airplane mode and tucked it away. The gate agent barely looked at me as she scanned my boarding pass. I walked down the jet bridge, shoulders lighter than I thought they could feel. When the plane lifted off the ground at 8, I pressed my forehead against the cold window. Below, Chicago shrank into a grid of steel and glass. Above, clouds opened into clean light. For the first time in years, calm seeped into me, quiet and steady, carrying me toward Bloomington and everything waiting there. Bloomington looked the same as it had when I left for college. The houses sat low to the ground, porches sagging under the weight of years, trees bending with the first bite of autumn. Nothing moved fast here. Even grief seemed to linger more slowly. The chapel was small, its brickwork faded, its stained glass muted by clouds. When I pushed the doors open, the creak of the pews answered like an old friend. People I hadn't seen in decades turned their heads, faces lined with time but softened by familiarity. One by one, they shared their stories. A neighbor spoke of the night my mother trudged through snow with a toolbox to fix his heater. A woman from the bakery remembered her dropping off pies every July because summer should always taste sweet. Even her barber came, holding a small box of cookies, laughing through tears about how Mom hated haircuts but always showed up with pie anyway. I stood near the front, hands shoved in my pockets, trying to breathe through the weight of it all. She hadn't left behind money or titles or projects to finish. She left behind respect earned quietly, given freely, never demanded. I felt the truth of that in my bones, heavier than any workload I had ever carried. That night, after the last car pulled away from the driveway, I wandered into the garage. The air smelled of sawdust and oil, familiar enough to ache. On the workbench lay a piece of walnut, half sanded, its edges still rough. A small pendant, no bigger than a thumbprint, waited as if she had just stepped out for a moment. I picked it up, felt the grit against my skin, and whispered into the quiet, "You never settled for less." Why did I? The heater in the corner hummed, filling the silence with a steady warmth. I turned the pendant over in my palm, and for the first time in years, I knew I was holding more than wood. I was holding a promise I hadn't yet kept. By the time I woke the next morning, my phone was already vibrating across the nightstand, notifications stacked one after another, relentless. I scrolled through them in silence. Urgent access required. Migration incomplete. Clients asking questions. The subject lines screamed panic, though I didn't bother opening the messages. Calls came next. Cheryl's clipped tone left voicemails full of veiled threats. Dorian's voice carried a strained politeness that sounded more like begging. Even Hal, who had never spoken to me outside of meetings, left a shaky message. "Please, Elena, we need to resolve this before the deadline." I sat at the kitchen table, the walnut pendant in front of me, and typed a single line in reply, "Tomorrow, 2:00 p.m. St. I'll send the invite." I hit send and leaned back. The timing wasn't an accident. I knew the Norland migration review was scheduled for that very hour. If they wanted what only I could give, they'd have to pay for it with sweat, nerves, and time slipping away. Later that afternoon, I opened a box of my mother's papers, bank statements, utility bills, grocery lists written in her looping hand. Near the bottom was an envelope with my name written across it. My chest tightened as I slid a finger under the flap. Inside was a single note in her careful script. "Dignity is never given. It is taken. Don't wait until you're my age to learn it." I read it once, then again, until the words blurred with tears. She had carried that truth her whole life, and now she was passing it to me. I pressed the note flat on the table beside the pendant, the two of them together forming a message I could no longer ignore. For the first time, I didn't just feel grief, I felt direction. The phone buzzed again, but I let it go dark. My mother's voice in ink was louder than anything waiting on the other end of that line. At exactly 2:00, I clicked the link and watched the screen fill with faces I knew too well. Hal's collar was wrinkled, his eyes red-rimmed. Cheryl sat stiff-backed, lips pressed so tight they looked bloodless. A third window appeared some legal advisor with square glasses and a tone already sharpened like a blade. Hal tried first. "We're in a critical situation. Elena, your documentation is missing. We need immediate access to finish the migration." I leaned closer to the camera. "You mean the scripts I built after hours? The guides I wrote because no one approved a training budget. Those were created unfunded, off hours, while I was left to sink or swim. They're mine." The legal advisor jumped in. Voice clipped. "Anything created while employed here is considered company property." I shook my head. "Not when it contains no client data, no internal IP, Nothing but the tools I built to survive your negligence. You can argue definitions all day, but the fact remains you can't move without me. Cheryl's jaw tightened. So, what are you asking? I didn't hesitate. $300 an hour. Prepaid. 20-hour minimum. Calls capped at 2 hours per day. I'm handling my mother's estate this week, so the schedule will be mine to set, not yours. Hal rubbed his forehead like the number itself caused him pain. Cheryl snapped. That's extortion. I let the silence hang, then replied, It's supply and demand. You demanded everything. Now you'll pay for what you ignored. The legal advisor typed furiously, then muttered something about expediency. Hal finally exhaled. Fine. We'll expedite the payment. I nodded once, calm settling over me like armor. The balance had shifted, and for the first time in 3 years, they were the ones scrambling. I ended the call without another word, closed my laptop, and picked up the walnut pendant from the table. The wood felt steadier in my hand than any contract I'd ever signed, and I knew the next move would be mine alone. The next morning, I logged into the session exactly on time. They were already waiting, faces tight with fatigue, eyes darting like animals cornered. I shared my screen without preamble, pulling up the first set of queries. This report fails because the fallback logic was deleted in January, I said, highlighting the line of code. I told you then. You ignored it. No one interrupted. The silence on their end was sharp enough to cut through the static. I moved on, opening the API call logs. Here, dead links patched with copy and paste fixes. Temporary at best. Reckless at worst. I scrolled further, exposing misconfigured parameters that caused reports to time out every third run. This is why your dashboards collapse under load. Duct tape doesn't hold steel. The first half hour was all edge, every word I spoke stripping away their illusions. By the midpoint, their posture changed. No more defensive interruptions. No clipped rebuttals. Just frantic typing, pens scratching. The sound of people trying to salvage a system they finally understood was held together by my hands, alone. I kept my tone steady, not cruel, but merciless in precision. Clarity had become my weapon, every correction a strike, every note a reminder of years they'd dismissed. An hour and 45 minutes later, I closed the walkthrough. That covers today's scope, I said evenly. Submit remaining questions in writing. Hal nodded, eyes hollow. Cheryl's lips pressed so tightly they seemed ready to split. I left the call and shut the laptop. The apartment was silent except for the low hum of the heater. On the table sat the walnut pendant, edges still rough. I picked up the sandpaper and pressed it to the wood, dragging slowly, evenly, until the grain smoothed beneath my thumb. My mother had always worked this way, steady, precise, never rushing the finish. As the pendant grew warmer under my hand, I realized I wasn't just sanding wood. I was sanding away years of silence, finding the shape of something I had buried too long. 2 days later, I joined another call. Their faces looked worse than before. Hal's tie crooked, Cheryl's hair pinned so tightly it seemed to ache. They wasted no time. Elena, Hal began, voice rehearsed but trembling. We'd like to extend a real offer. Director level, remote flexibility, your own team of 3 to start. You'd report directly to me, a 50% raise, and a permanent seat on the executive planning calls. For years, I had dreamed of hearing words like that. Recognition, leadership, a chance to prove I wasn't just the glue in the cracks. Yet, as the titles and percentages spilled out of his mouth, I felt nothing. The silence inside me didn't ache anymore. It rang with clarity. I leaned forward. You only value me now because you're afraid. I buried my mother last week, and all you gave me were deadlines instead of dignity. Now you want loyalty. Cheryl cut in, sharp and defensive. We're trying to make this right. We admit we underestimated you, but this is your chance to step into what you deserve. I shook my head slowly. You don't get it. I deserved it years ago when I was building your systems at 2 in the morning. I deserved it when I missed family dinners to fix mistakes you couldn't handle. You ignored me until fear forced you to look. Hal pressed on, almost pleading. Can't we start over? This offer is genuine. Too late, I said flatly. You had your chance to treat me with respect. Now all you're offering is desperation wrapped in a title. Silence filled the space between us, heavy and final. I watched them shift uncomfortably, as if they were finally realizing what it meant to lose me. I ended the call without another word, closed the laptop, and set the pendant beside it, the wood now smoother under my thumb than it had been days before. The grain felt steady, like the decision I'd already made, leading me toward the only closure that mattered. Weeks passed, and the noise from my former office faded into a distant hum. By the time I joined a small firm in Columbus, I had stopped wondering what chaos they were drowning in. The new company was just 10 people, each introduction warm, unpolished, real. On my very first call, the CEO looked at me through the screen and asked, "How are you holding up after losing your mom?" Not what can you deliver, how fast can you work, but simply that. The words caught me off guard, stinging behind my eyes. For the first time in decades, I felt human at work, not a machine in disguise. The pace was slower, the conversations lighter, but the respect was steady. Deadlines came and went without knives hidden in them. If someone fell behind, the rest picked up the weight. I learned what it felt like to be part of a team instead of a patch kit holding cracks together. Months later, on a quiet Saturday morning, I returned to my mother's garage. The walnut pendant was still on the bench where I had left it. I sanded it slowly, layer by layer, until the roughness gave way to a smooth surface that fit perfectly in my palm. It wasn't flawless, tiny grooves marked where the grain resisted, but it was solid, strong, and unmistakably finished. I placed it on my desk beside my laptop. The pendant didn't just remind me of her. It reminded me of myself, the parts I had smoothed, the parts I had reclaimed. Sometimes, I thought, revenge isn't fire or fury. It's leaving with everything they never bothered to value and letting the silence left behind speak louder than any argument ever could. I closed my eyes, breathed in the quiet, and felt the weight of both loss and freedom settle into something steady. For the first time, I wasn't carrying their burden. I was carrying my own life forward.